Chapter 2. Internal Transformation of the City of Rome and of the Western Empire. Part 2. The end of gladiatorial combats. Prudentius had concluded his invitation to the emperor by begging him to put a stop to the gladiatorial games, which still disgraced all Roman rejoicings. Many Christians looked forward with dread to the days of the emperor's triumph, with its usual sanguinary displays, for all through the 4th century, gladiatorial combats had continued in vogue. In 325, Constantine the Great had forbidden them, but quite without result. Plebeians and patricians, pagan citizens and crowds of Christian folk, all poured eagerly into the Roman amphitheater, even in St. Augustine's days. That holy man describes from personal observation among his own friends what a degrading fascination such scenes could exercise even over cultured minds. Was this infamous relic of paganism to be allowed in Rome under Honorius? As a fact, in conformity with ancient festal custom, the gladiatorial combat had been proclaimed. On the appointed day, the Colosseum's vast amphitheater was crammed with the usual concourse of citizens and strangers assembled from all parts to see the emperor. If necessary, the 4 tiers of this gigantic building could contain 45,000 people. Formerly, the celebration of these games used to be considered a sacred function dedicated to the gods, but now the reduced number of priests and flamens only acted at most as organizers or stewards. No more Vestal virgins were seen. Christians had too loudly complained that these virgins were restrained by no sense of maiden modesty from exposing themselves in conspicuous apparel to the eyes of the maddened multitude in order to watch the blood flow, and even, as Prudentius remarks, sharing in the popular frenzy, and by turning down their thumbs, deciding the death of the badly wounded. The scene in the amphitheater, therefore, progressed in the order prescribed from time immemorial. The procession of the gladiators, or pompa, was held before the eyes of the court, assembled in the imperial pulvinar, before ladies sitting in their own reserved gallery, before the viri clarissimi in their prominent seats on the podium, and before the countless massed throng who had streamed through the 80 gateways. The unhappy band of gladiators, composed of slaves, criminals, and professional pugilists, was conducted by their lanistae or trainers. They must march round the arena to salute the court and the crowd before they die. Ave Imperator, morituri te salutant. Then, as usual, they fell apart into 2 divisions. The retiari with their nets had sharp tridents and daggers as weapons of attack. Their opponents were the lightly armed sequitores and the heavily armed mirmilones. In the passage alluded to against these games, Prudentius especially mentions this pompa through the amphitheater, the tridents, the secutores, the infamous arena. When speaking of the struggle itself, he describes the dust raised by the combatants in the cave, the wild cries of the audience, the moans and groans of the down-thrust gladiators. The picture is so vivid that we could fancy ourselves transported back to the first savage times of early Rome, or the blood-stained orgies of the period when debased paganism reigned supreme. Yet nearly 100 years had elapsed since the Emperor Constantine had set up the saving symbol of the cross. These grim games under Honorius were, however, to be the last of their kind in Rome. A pious monk had pressed forward with the populace into the Colosseum. The audience, breathlessly following the sports, doubtless scarcely noticed the strange, poorly clad visitor. Suddenly, when the strife was at its hottest and the blood began to flow, the monk swung himself over the parapet into the arena and rushed towards the combatants, meaning to separate them. Thousands of eyes were now fixed on his solitary form. All heard with amazement that he was commanding every one to pause in the name of Christ. In the name of the religion of love, he was boldly demanding that these horrors should be stopped. As might be foreseen, directly the first surprise was over, the whole excited mob turned against the rash intruder. In a moment, he was the object of the united fury of audience and gladiators, and fell dead amongst those whom he was seeking to save. As a martyr, he offered the sacrifice of his life, thus setting a seal to the earnestness of his protest. Whether the games ended with the removal of his mangled body is not mentioned. Doubtless when calm succeeded frenzy, many were moved with compassion for the stranger's fate. Enquiry revealed that the murdered monk had quitted his eastern home and pilgrimed to Rome on purpose to put a stop to the gladiatorial encounters. It is believed he was named Telemachus, and it was his firm hope that if this mad cruelty could be made to cease within the sacred walls of Rome, it would end all over the world. His object was attained, for the emperor, deeply moved by the act of heroism, sent forth a stern decree forbidding for all time these sports in Rome. This prohibition seems to have proved quite effectual. First at Rome, and shortly after all over the empire, this form of public rejoicing appears to have stopped entirely. Theodoret, writing as a contemporary of Telemachus's intervention, further tells us that at the emperor's instigation, the monk or hermit was placed on the list of saints. Thus the sacrifice of a single martyr's life sufficed to terminate the many human hecatombs of the Roman arena. These sanguinary games lasted far into the Middle Ages in the milder form of combats between wild beasts. Prudentius had already pointed out that people ought to be content with them, for they were quite sufficient substitutes, and a stepping stone to more refined pleasures. The Colosseum, from its enormous size and space, had always been a favorite place of amusement with the Roman populace, and underwent several restorations, especially after an earthquake in 424. One of these restorations is proved by a well-preserved inscription bearing the name of Rufus Caecina Felix Lampadius, city prefect under Valentinian III. Soon after, another still more important renovation took place through Valentinian's own care. This was gratefully acknowledged in an inscription running all round the inside wall above the podium. In 1880, it was found possible to set up once more, in their original place, the exceptionally large letters forming this inscription. Amongst other things, it tells us that the Emperor Valentinian had redrained the podium and thus relieved the whole area of accumulated water. At the present time, this work has had to be repeated, for stagnant water was often noticeable. Towards the last years of gladiatorial sports in Rome, Arpagius Lupus, prefect of the city Annona, had erected a building at Portus Romanus, or Porto, for the use of the wrestlers. Its inscription was recently discovered. On the reverse side, it had received a curious addition in characters belonging to the end of the 5th or beginning of the 6th century, saying that the structure had stood empty since its erection, but that now the Vir Clarissimus, Acolius Abatus, in compliance with the request of the inhabitants, had devoted it to another public purpose. Thus at Portus Romanus also, gladiatorial combats had ceased by the beginning of the 5th century.